Every nation has its turning points, moments when ambition, conflict, and vision collide to redraw the future. In the story of the United States, few figures stand at the crossroads of history as sharply as James K. Polk, the 11th president. His name may not echo as loudly as Washington or Lincoln, yet his decisions carved the very shape of the modern American map. Behind the quiet, disciplined exterior was a man driven by certainty that America's destiny stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and that his presidency would be the engine to get it there. This series travels back to the turbulent mid-19th century, when the country, still young and restless, pushed its boundaries into contested territories, from political battles in Washington to the dusty battlefields of Mexico, from the feverish dream of manifest destiny to the moral storms it unleashed. Polk's era was a crucible of ambition and consequence. You'll meet generals who became legends, diplomats who defied presidents, and ordinary Americans whose lives were swept into the tide of expansion. Before the gold rush, before the Civil War, before the modern United States, there was this pivotal presidency. And its story is far more dramatic than most remember. Chapter 1. The Boy Born into a Country Still Learning to Walk. The story of America's 11th president, James Knox Polk, begins not with him, but with the raw, unpredictable nation he inherited. To understand Polk, you have to picture the United States the way it looked when he was born in 1895, just 16 years after the Declaration of Independence, when the paint on the idea of America was still wet. George Washington, the very first president, was in office. The White House had not yet become the White House. Most Americans still called it the President's House. The country stretched only to the Mississippi River, a thin sliver of settlements clinging to the eastern seaboard, while the vast land beyond was a mosaic of native nations, French traders, Spanish forts, and wilderness that swallowed travelers whole. Roads were muddy scars on the landscape. News traveled on horseback. The federal government was smaller than a modern city council. Into this fragile experiment walked a boy named James, born in a cabin in Mecklenburg County. He was the oldest of 10 children, an earnest, thin, watchful child who rarely caused trouble, but soaked up everything around him. His father, Samuel Polk, was a farmer with ambitions bigger than his acreage. His mother, Jane, was tough and deeply religious, the sort of frontier woman who could quote scripture while helping deliver a calf in the barn. Life on the edge of the frontier was not gentle. Illness prowled households like an invisible wolf, and so did uncertainty. But it also bred something else. A fierce belief that life could be what you carved from it with your own hands. The idea suited young James. When James was 10, his family packed everything they owned: tools, livestock, seeds, quilts, the family Bible, and made the rough journey west to Tennessee, then the frontier of frontiers. The Polks settled near the Duck River, a place where land was rich, neighbors were few, and danger was a frequent visitor. Tennessee was also the stomping ground of a man whose shadow would fall across Polk's entire life, Andrew Jackson. Jackson was already a rising figure, fiery, fearless, and as subtle as a cannonball. Polk's father admired him, and the boy watched Jackson's legend grow. The duels, the courtroom battles, the stories whispered about the man who would later become America's 7th president. For James, Jackson represented something rare and magnetic, a living example of how a man could begin nowhere and claw his way into the nation's story. Yet Polk was not born for the battlefield. As a child, he was frail, plagued by mysterious pains and fevers. At 17, he underwent a gruesome surgery to remove urinary stones, without anesthesia, as the frontier doctors preferred brute speed over comfort. Most people would have carried the trauma of such an experience forever. Polk carried something else from it, an iron will. Once his health returned, it was as if he were trying to make up for lost time. He devoured books, he practiced speeches in the mirror, he studied the law until candle wax pooled across his desk. He wanted more than the quiet life of a frontier farmer. He wanted influence. He wanted to shape the country whose growth he had witnessed since childhood. The America he stepped into as a young man was a country quivering with potential and contradiction. Slavery was expanding, even as Northern abolitionists grew louder. Settlers were pushing west, provoking conflict with native nations and European powers. New states were joining the Union like restless siblings, crowding into a small house. Every debate, banking, tariffs, voting rights, felt like an argument about the very identity of the young republic. Polk entered this chaotic national conversation with the meticulous mind of an accountant and the intensity of a preacher. Where Jackson was fire, Polk was calculation. Where Jackson's speeches stirred crowds, Polk's strategies quietly won battles. Yet the two men understood each other. They shared a worldview built on loyalty, expansion, and a sometimes ruthless certainty that America's destiny pointed west. Their partnership would one day help shape the borders of the modern United States. But that is far ahead in the story. For now, imagine young Polk standing at the edge of Tennessee's rolling hills, a wiry figure with a solemn face, watching the nation stretch and twist around him. The country was still learning to walk. He was still learning to speak. But somewhere between the uncertainty of the frontier and the bold dreams of a rising republic, the path of the future 11th president began to take shape. Behind him, the era of George Washington, the cautious, anxious, hopeful beginning of the United States, was fading into memory. Ahead, Polk sensed something larger. A country hungry for land, power, and definition. A country ready to grow beyond anything its founders imagined. And he intended to be part of that story. Chapter 2. The Apprentice of Andrew Jackson. James Polk did not enter politics with fireworks or fanfare. He slipped into it the way a careful man steps into a river he plans to cross, testing the current, studying the rocks, then committing fully. By the time he arrived in Nashville as a young law graduate in the 1820s, the city was buzzing with ambition. Merchants, lawyers, soldiers, land speculators, everyone seemed to be chasing a bigger America. Hovering over them all was one unmistakable presence: Andrew Jackson. Jackson was no longer just a frontier hero. He was a national figure, a hurricane in human form. His victory in the Battle of New Orleans had turned him into a symbol of American grit. His enemies said he was a tyrant. His supporters said he was the country's spine. Polk, who had admired him from afar since childhood, saw something else: a once-in-a-generation political force. Their first meeting wasn't dramatic. No thunder, no destiny proclaiming itself. It was a simple conversation between a rising young lawyer and the most influential man in Tennessee. But Polk left the room electrified. Jackson had an uncanny way of making people feel like the future belonged to those brave enough to seize it. Polk wanted that courage. Jackson sensed the ambition. A quiet bond formed, mentor and apprentice, though neither said it aloud. Polk's early political steps were modest. In 1823, he won a seat in the Tennessee legislature. He stood straight, spoke carefully, kept his notes in perfect order, and never wasted a sentence. While other young politicians tried to charm the room, Polk dissected arguments with the precision of a surveyor drawing boundary lines. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't funny, but he was relentless. That relentlessness caught attention. Polk soon earned the nickname Young Hickory, a nod to Jackson's own title, Old Hickory. The comparison was not accidental. Polk believed in Jackson's vision of democracy, a government that expanded opportunities for common people, well, at least common white men, and pushed power away from elite circles in the East. To Polk, politics was not theater, it was arithmetic. Organize supporters, learn the rules, master the details, and never, ever lose track of a goal. Even so, Polk wasn't all discipline and spreadsheets. There was a touch of idealism buried beneath the stern exterior. He believed passionately in the young nation's potential. He believed ordinary people should have a voice in government. He believed America's destiny stretched west across mountains and deserts he had never seen. Expansion wasn't just a policy. It was a mission. In 1825, Polk took the leap to national politics and won a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. Washington City, muddy streets, dim taverns, endless arguments became his new battlefield. Picture Polk in his boarding house room, quill in hand, stacks of letters at his elbow, studying committees, memorizing parliamentary rules like scripture. While others drank late into the night, he pored over budgets and tariffs. In an era when congressmen often treated politics like a side job, Polk treated it as a life's calling. And it paid off. Polk quickly became one of Jackson's most loyal allies in Congress. When Jackson ran for president in 1828, Polk worked the House like a chessboard, counting supporters, persuading doubters, building alliances. When Jackson won, Polk became one of the administration's fiercest defenders. That loyalty shaped Polk's identity. He wasn't just a lawmaker. He was part of a movement, Jacksonian democracy, a political revolution that challenged entrenched institutions and pushed for greater national unity and westward expansion. While Jackson swung the axe at the mighty Bank of the United States, Polk sharpened the arguments that justified the blow. Over time, Polk rose steadily through the House hierarchy. His colleagues learned something important. Underestimate him at your peril. His polite manner hid a spine of tempered steel. He remembered every promise, every vote, every slight. He kept his enemies close and his spreadsheets closer. In 1835, a decade after he first arrived in Washington, Polk achieved something remarkable. He was elected Speaker of the House, one of the youngest ever to hold the position. His gavel didn't make headlines, but it shaped laws, budgets, debates, and the entire flow of congressional power. He ruled the chamber with the blend of discipline and quiet intensity. Always precise, never impulsive, always advancing the Jacksonian agenda. But Polk's political life wasn't the only thing evolving. During his early years in Tennessee, he had met Sarah Childress, a woman with a sharp mind and a diplomatic grace that would one day become legendary. Sarah wasn't just a supportive spouse. She became Polk's closest advisor, polished where he was severe, intuitive where he was methodical. Washington insiders joked that Sarah could charm a room faster than James could finish saying the word tariff. The couple formed a political partnership so seamless, it often appeared choreographed. In many ways, Sarah became the social intelligence of the Polk household. James became its engine. Together, they began to imagine a future larger than the speaker's chair, larger than Congress, even larger than Jackson's shadow. Yet the path ahead would not be smooth. For every step forward, American politics was generating new storms: debates over banks, slavery, the power of states, and the relentless push into the western frontier. The nation was splitting into factions, each convinced they alone understood the country's destiny. Polk's rise had been steady so far, almost predictable. But the next stage of his life, the battles in Tennessee, the governorship, the years in the political wilderness, would test him in ways Washington's structured halls never could. And as the nation strained at its seams, so too would the ambitions of the man determined to shape it. Chapter 3: The Fall of a Rising Star. By the mid-1830s, James K. Polk had climbed Washington's political ladder with such steady precision that some colleagues joked he'd been born holding a rule book. As Speaker of the House, he controlled debates with a calm authority that felt almost mathematical. But politics is never a straight line, and just when Polk seemed securely perched at the top, the ground under him began to shift. A new reality was taking shape in America, one of roaring economic booms followed by spectacular busts. The Panic of 1837, a nationwide financial crisis, hit like a sudden storm. Banks collapsed, businesses went dark, farms were swallowed by debt, and unemployment spread across cities that had barely existed a decade before. The Jacksonian Democrats, Polk's political family, took most of the blame. It wasn't entirely fair, but fairness rarely wins elections. Sensing the changing winds, Polk made a decision as bold as it was risky. He left Washington. After 14 intense years in Congress, he returned to Tennessee to run for governor. The move confused some friends. Why leave national power for a state office? But Polk understood something many didn't. To reach the presidency, if he ever dared to imagine that, he needed a home base. He needed Tennessee behind him. And so, he went home. Tennessee in 1839 was an ideological battlefield. The Whig Party was gaining strength, energized by charismatic leaders like Henry Clay, who could charm crowds with ease and paint political visions in rich, compelling colors. Polk was the opposite: controlled, reserved, focused on policy rather than theatrics. But he had something the Whigs didn't: a deep connection to Tennessee's frontier roots and a reputation for steady competence. His campaign style was unique. Polk wasn't a natural performer, but he was relentless. He traveled dusty roads from Courthouse Square to Tavern Porch, speaking with the precision of a man who wanted every word to land like a carefully placed stone. He talked about the economy, state improvements, education, and the need to keep Tennessee aligned with Jacksonian principles. And against expectations, maybe even his own, he won. James K. Polk was now governor of Tennessee, the highest office in the state. To his opponents, it felt like a surprise ambush. To his supporters, it was proof that discipline could beat charisma. Yet, governing in Tennessee turned out to be a far different beast from managing the House of Representatives. In Congress, Polk had rules, committees, and procedures. He thrived on structure. Tennessee politics was more like a frontier wrestling match: loud crowds, unpredictable allegiances, and constant pressure from local interests. The Whigs hammered Polk relentlessly, blaming the Democrats for every ripple of economic pain. Newspapers mocked him for being too serious. Opponents accused him of being Jackson's shadow rather than a leader in his own right. Still, Polk fought back with unwavering determination. For a while, it worked. He defended Democratic policies, traveled tirelessly, and tried to unify a state that seemed eager to split. But the economy kept grinding people down, and the Whigs became expert at pointing fingers. In 1841, after just one term, Polk ran for re-election. He lost. It stunned him. For the first time since his youth, the unstoppable trajectory of his career had cracked. Yet Polk wasn't the type to retreat quietly. He ran again in 1843, throwing every ounce of energy into the fight. Sarah Polk, as always, was at his side, organizing supporters, writing letters, reading the political weather with uncanny accuracy. But again, he lost. 2 defeats in a row, a political exile before he was even 50. In the quiet aftermath, Polk retreated to his Nashville home, a lean, thoughtful man surrounded by maps, letters, and the fading echoes of ambition. His enemies believed he was finished. Even some allies wondered whether his career had topped out. American politics had a short memory. A man out of office might as well be out of the country. Yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. The Democratic Party was fractured. National leaders were aging. The question of America's place in the world, its borders, its destiny, was becoming the defining issue of the decade. Expansion fever gripped the nation, fueled by dreams of the Pacific coast, open farmland, new trade routes, and the intoxicating idea that the United States was meant to stretch from ocean to ocean. This was Polk's territory. He understood the mechanics of power, the importance of loyalty, and the allure of a bigger America. He had spent his entire life studying the chessboard of national politics. And though he sat in political silence, he watched every move. He wasn't finished, not even close. Inside Democratic circles, whispers began to spread. Polk's discipline, Polk's loyalty, Polk's meditation as a man who kept promises and finished tasks. Some party leaders, especially those loyal to Jackson's legacy, wondered whether he might still have a role to play. But no one, absolutely no one, predicted what would happen next. In 1844, the Democratic Party arrived at its national convention divided and exhausted. The leading candidates couldn't agree on the future of Texas, Western expansion, or the soul of the party. Ballot after ballot produced no victory. Delegates grew restless. Arguments flared. The convention teetered on chaos. That was when one name, unexpected, almost whispered at first, began to rise. James K. Polk. Not as a senator, not as vice president, as candidate for president of the United States. The man who had lost twice in Tennessee. The man who had retreated in near silence. The man few believed was still in the game. It felt like a political miracle, and yet, for those who truly knew him, it was something else entirely. The logical next step of a life defined by strategy, patience, and a will of iron. Polk had spent decades preparing for this moment, without ever saying it aloud. And as the convention's storm of ballots finally settled, he emerged not as a compromise, but as a new force, someone with a clear vision for America's future. A vision bold enough to redraw the map of the continent. Chapter 4: The Dark Horse Awakens. The summer of 1844 arrived like a drum roll. Delegates from across the nation poured into Baltimore for the Democratic National Convention, each carrying the hopes, fears, and grudges of a country on the verge of transformation. They expected a showdown between established giants, Martin Van Buren, Lewis Cass, James Buchanan, men with long resumes and louder ambitions. No one arrived thinking they would nominate James K. Polk. Polk himself didn't expect it. He had quietly aimed for the vice presidency, a respectable return from political exile. But presidential dreams? Those belonged to grander figures, or so everyone thought. The Great Fault Line splitting the Democrats in 1844 was Texas. Annex it and risk war with Mexico? Reject it and alienate Southern expansionists. Martin Van Buren opposed annexation. Andrew Jackson supported it.
Van Buren's stance cost him dearly. On the first ballot he led, but nowhere near a majority. Then something curious happened. On the second ballot, Van Buren slipped. On the third, his support collapsed like wet clay. The convention turned restless. Delegates shuffled. Whispers thickened. Someone needed to unite the party. Someone acceptable to the pro-annexation South and the expansion-hungry West. Someone loyal to the Jackson tradition, but not tangled in the rivalries of the old guard. A delegate looked around the hall. "Polk," he murmured. The word spread like a spark, skittering across dry leaves. Polk had two advantages no one predicted. First, he was the young Hickory, the political heir to Andrew Jackson. Second, he had no major enemies. He was ambitious, but not polarizing, loyal, but not imposing. He was the sort of man who could slip between factions like water through uneven ground. On the 8th ballot, his support surged. On the 9th, the hall shifted. On the 10th, thunder. James K. Polk, unanimously nominated for president. The crowd exploded. Delegates shouted. Hats flew into the air. Reporters sprinted to telegraph offices. A man who had twice lost the governorship of Tennessee was suddenly the standard-bearer of a national party. Newspapers rushed to find a label for him. The phrase that stuck was one that would echo through American political history: the dark horse candidate. A dark horse was a racehorse unknown to bettors, suddenly charging from behind to win. Polk embraced the title. It fit. He had been underestimated his entire life. Too quiet, too disciplined, too methodical. People followed Jackson's lightning. They overlooked Polk's steady flame.
Now, the flame lit the path to the White House. His opponent, Whig candidate Henry Clay, was everything Polk was not. Dazzling, charismatic, beloved by crowds. Clay had spent decades chasing the presidency. He had tasted defeat before, but this time he felt certain. Who could lose to Polk, of all people? Clay soon discovered the answer: a man with a message the country was ready to hear. Polk ran on a bold, almost intoxicating promise: annex Texas, settle Oregon, secure California, and expand the United States to the Pacific. Expansion wasn't a policy. It was the emotional pulse of the era, a belief that America was destined to grow, to spread liberty, to claim the continent. Historians later gave the idea a name: manifest destiny. Polk didn't coin the term, but he embodied it. He told voters exactly what he would do if elected. No vague poetry, no hedging. Polk issued a list, direct, measurable, almost stubbornly clear. In a world of politicians promising everything, Polk promised specific things. Surprisingly, the nation liked that. The campaign became a battle of styles. Clay dazzled with speeches. Polk countered with precision. Clay appealed to emotion. Polk appealed to destiny. Clay tried to paint Polk as inexperienced. Polk painted Clay as indecisive on expansion. Polk had a secret weapon, too: Sarah. She read every newspaper, tracked every rumor, studied every state, and advised her husband with the strategist's intuition. She crafted his public image: disciplined, earnest, trustworthy. In private, she reminded him of the stakes. If he won, they would help shape a nation. If he lost, they would fade into Tennessee obscurity. Election day came. The vote was excruciatingly close. Polk won by a sliver in New York, just enough to tip the Electoral College. Henry Clay, the great compromiser, fell once again. Polk went to bed that night President-elect of the United States. At 49, he was the youngest man ever elected to the office at that time. Yet Polk had already set a limit on his own presidency. Before the campaign even ended, he had made a private decision, a promise to Sarah, a promise to himself. He would serve one term, no more. He would accomplish his goals quickly, decisively, and then step away. That clarity fueled him. It also unnerved the political world. A president with nothing to lose is a dangerous creature, especially one who believes destiny is calling. The America Polk was about to inherit was restless. The question of slavery simmered beneath every debate. The boundaries of the nation were blurred. The West was a canvas of contested claims and clashing dreams. Foreign powers watched the young republic with wary eyes. And into this volatile moment walked James K. Polk, calm, precise, determined, ready not simply to govern, but to remake the map of the continent. Chapter 5. The President with a Clock in His Head. James K. Polk entered the White House in March of 1845 with the expression of a man who had already packed his bags for departure. He had promised to serve one term, and that single decision reshaped everything he did. While other presidents eased into office like settlers exploring a new frontier, Polk arrived as if stepping onto a battlefield with a precise map in hand. He carried a notebook filled with 4 grand objectives, his famous to-do list, written long before he ever touched the presidential desk. Reduce tariffs. Establish an independent national treasury. Settle the Oregon boundary dispute with Britain. Acquire California and the Southwest. They were audacious goals, each one worthy of a full presidency. Polk intended to finish all 4 in 4 years. Washington's political class didn't know what to make of him. They expected the polite Tennessean with neat handwriting and calm manners. They did not expect a workhorse with the drive of an overclocked steam engine. Diplomats who met him described his eyes as quiet but burning. Cabinet members joked that he kept time not by clocks, but by deadlines beating inside his chest. The first thing Polk did was transform the White House into a disciplined workspace. No long social afternoons, no pointless visits, no wasted speeches. He woke early, worked late, and read letters with the intensity of a man memorizing battle strategy. Sarah Polk turned the presidential mansion into a dignified, alcohol-free salon, a place of order rather than chaos. Even political rivals admitted the atmosphere felt different, sharper, almost scholarly. Oh, yet the country he now led was far from orderly. It was a nation buzzing with ambition, fear, and possibility. Railroads stretched west, telegraph lines stitched cities together. Immigrants poured in from Europe. New states clamored for admission. And everywhere, the same debate echoed. How big should America become, and at what cost? 2 major frontiers demanded immediate attention. One was lush, green, and controlled by Britain, Oregon. The other was vast, sun-scorched, and controlled by Mexico, California, and the Southwest. Polk decided to tackle both simultaneously. His cabinet was stunned. One crisis at a time, they urged. Polk shook his head. Time was short. His presidency was a 4-year sprint, not a slow march. He began with Oregon, where American settlers and British fur traders lived in a tense, decades-long standoff. American expansionists shouted 54-40 or fight, meaning the U.S. should claim the northern boundary all the way to latitude 54 degrees 40. Polk let them shout. He didn't correct them. It never hurts a negotiator to have a loud crowd behind him. Privately, Polk aimed for compromise. War with Britain would drain the treasury, stall domestic reforms, and distract from the real prize, Mexico's northern territories. That region, California, New Mexico, the Rio Grande Valleys, was the crown jewel of American dreams. But Britain needed to believe he was willing to fight. Letters flew back and forth across the Atlantic faster than ever, thanks to new steamships and telegraphs. British diplomats huffed. American newspapers raged. Polk remained calm. He moved the pieces on the board like a master strategist waiting for the right break. Meanwhile, he attacked his domestic goals with the same sharp focus. He pushed Congress to slash tariffs, a victory for Southern and Western farmers. He revived the independent treasury, ensuring federal money stayed out of private banks. 2 items on his 4-point list were checked off within months. Washington insiders stared in disbelief. Presidents weren't supposed to move this fast. But the biggest storms were gathering far beyond the Potomac. To understand Polk, imagine a man standing before a giant, uncarved stone. Where others saw obstacles, he saw shapes hidden inside, waiting to be freed. The continent was that stone. The shape waiting inside, in Polk's mind, was an America stretched wide, wealthy, and united. Yet every inch gained in the West threatened the fragile balance between free and slave states. Every negotiation with Britain risked foreign conflict. Every step toward Texas and California nudged the nation closer to war. Polk's critics accused him of being reckless, a warmonger, a schemer, hiding behind politeness. Some even whispered that he was trying to remove Mexico from the map entirely. His supporters said something different. They saw a president who kept promises, worked harder than any man in Washington, and believed America had a mission written in the horizon itself. In late 1845, after months of hard bargaining, Polk reached a peaceful agreement with Britain. The Oregon Treaty drew the border at the 49th parallel. No war, no crisis, just the quiet triumph of diplomacy. Newspapers celebrated. Congress cheered. 2 major powers had avoided conflict. Now Polk had one frontier left, and it was the most volatile of all: Mexico. A nation still reeling from internal revolutions, a government unsure of its own authority, a border dispute with the United States that burned like a fuse under a powder keg. Polk wanted a peaceful purchase of California and New Mexico. Mexico refused to even discuss selling them. The standoff drifted towards something darker. As 1846 approached, Polk stood on the threshold of decisions that would change the continent forever and ignite a war no one could fully control. Chapter 6: The Match That Lit the Continent. The winter of 1846 settled over Washington like a heavy quilt. Snow muffled the city's clattering streets, and the Potomac steamed faintly in the cold air. Inside the White House, James K. Polk worked by lamplight long after most of the Capitol slept. He was a man chasing time, and time was always a few steps ahead. The Oregon dispute with Britain had been settled peacefully. That should have eased tensions. It didn't, because the other frontier, Mexico, was a tinderbox, and Polk had just sent a man carrying a lit match straight into it. His name was General Zachary Taylor, a calm, stocky soldier whose relaxed manner hid a quiet ferocity. Polk ordered him to take several thousand troops and move them to the Rio Grande, a river claimed by Texas but disputed by Mexico. From Mexico's point of view, Taylor's movement was an invasion. From Polk's point of view, it was simply the United States standing on its own ground. The truth? The border was a mess. No map agreed with another. The land between the Rio Grande and the Nueces River was a vague, wind-blown space of ranches, scrubland, and old Spanish land grants. Both nations claimed it. Neither controlled it. Polk believed that Mexico had already shown hostility by refusing to negotiate the sale of California and New Mexico. He also knew Mexico was politically unstable. Presidents rose and fell like the tides. One week they'd promise negotiations, the next they'd retreat into silence or outrage. Still, Polk didn't want to be the one to fire first. He wanted Mexico to reveal its intentions. Strategy whispered more loudly to him than pride. So Polk marched. He moved across the Nueces, across the disputed lands, and encamped on the north bank of the Rio Grande, directly facing the Mexican city of Matamoros. Soldiers on both sides could hear each other's campfires crackle at night. Drums and bugles echoed across the river like challenges tossed into the dark. Mexican generals bristled. The government declared Taylor's presence an act of aggression. Reinforcements hurried toward Matamoros. American scouts reported cavalry sightings in the brush. Tension thickened until even the horses felt it. Back in Washington, Polk watched the reports like a chess player studying a shifting board. He still hoped for negotiation, but he also understood human nature. Pride, fear, and misunderstanding have launched as many wars as ambition ever has. Then, in late April, the match touched the powder. A small American patrol rolled north of the Rio Grande and encountered a larger Mexican force. Shots rang out. Several Americans were killed, others were captured. The news raced toward Washington faster than the spring thaw. Polk read the dispatch in silence. He always avoided dramatics, even when drama swirled around him like a storm. He placed the paper down and said, simply, "Mexico has invaded our territory and shed American blood on American soil." Critics would later argue whether he believed those words fully or whether they were the political phrasing needed to rally Congress. The disputed region gave both nations excuses, but Polk did not hesitate. He went before Congress and asked for a declaration of war. Congress erupted into arguments. Northern Whigs accused Polk of provoking the conflict intentionally. A young Illinois congressman named Abraham Lincoln demanded to know the exact spot where American blood had been shed. Southern and Western Democrats rallied behind Polk, claiming it was Mexico that had forced the issue. Outside the Capitol, ordinary Americans didn't bother with diplomatic hair-splitting. They saw a foreign army killing American soldiers. They demanded action. Newspapers filled with fiery headlines and heroic drawings of frontier troops. Volunteers enlisted by the thousands. The nation, for better or worse, was ready for war. Polk got his declaration. But something changed in him that spring. Until then, expansion had been a grand, almost abstract idea, a map filling out, a promise fulfilled. Now it was becoming something heavier, a conflict that would send young men across deserts, through heat and disease, into battles where glory was a thin mask over tragedy. Yet Polk didn't flinch. His mission remained the same. He still believed destiny lay westward, and he believed the war, however painful, would be short. The generals he brought forward were a curious mix of old veterans and rising talents. Taylor, sturdy and dependable, would command the northern front. In the south, Polk began assembling another army for a bold, unprecedented offensive. The entire conflict would unfold across landscapes Americans barely understood. Salt flats, volcanic mountains, ancient cities built long before Columbus ever dreamed of crossing an ocean. As 1846 unfolded, young officers scribbled letters home from dusty camps. Among them were men whose names would later dominate American history: Grant, Lee, Sherman, McClellan, Longstreet, all learning the brutal craft of war under the Mexican sun. For many of them, this conflict was a proving ground. For Polk, it was a countdown. His 4-year clock was still ticking, and every battle would determine whether his vision of a continental America would become reality or collapse under fire. Chapter 7. The War Nobody Wanted, Yet Everyone Expected. James K. Polk woke before dawn on May 11th,
1846, to the sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway. Washington City was still, the Potomac wrapped in morning mist, but the White House was wide awake. A messenger arrived with a letter clutched so tightly his knuckles were white. Mexican cavalry had crossed the Rio Grande and attacked American troops. It was the spark on a pile of dry tinder that had been stacking for years. Polk broke the seal with a calmness that startled even him. He had expected this moment. Maybe not this hour, maybe not this specific patch of riverbank, but the collision between two young, expanding republics felt inevitable. Mexico, wounded by decades of internal struggle, still considered Texas its runaway province. The United States, swelling with westward fever, believed the boundary lay at the Rio Grande. The region in between was a political ghost, claimed passionately, controlled by no one. The president gathered his cabinet. They arrived in various stages of dress, faces pale, eyes sharp. Polk read the letter aloud. When he finished, silence filled the room like smoke. "This means war," Secretary of State Buchanan muttered. "Or," Polk replied, "it means Mexico has accepted the war they insisted was already happening." Congress debated fiercely. Some representatives argued that Polk had deliberately placed American troops in disputed land. Others claimed Mexico had shed American blood on American soil. The chamber, always noisy, became volcanic. Newspapers fanned the flames or threw buckets of doubt, depending on their political loyalties. But the outcome was never truly in question. Expansion was the wind at America's back, and war, terrible, wasteful, glorious in the eyes of its supporters, was the sail. Polk understood both the danger and the opportunity. War could bring California, New Mexico, and secure the Texas border permanently. War could also tear apart the fragile unity of North and South. Every square mile gained was a new battlefield in the larger, darker conflict over slavery. Still, Polk was determined. "We must finish what history has begun," he wrote in his diary. General Zachary Taylor, the rough, laconic soldier known to his men as Old Rough and Ready, became the face of the fight. He wore muddy boots, disdained uniforms, and fought like a man who believed victory came from stubbornness rather than brilliance. And it worked. One battle after another fell to the Americans. Palo Alto, Resaca de la Palma, Monterrey, each victory fed public enthusiasm and quieted most critics. In the West, another figure rose, a young officer with a calm voice and an iron spine, Winfield Scott. He would soon make a march that echoed the campaigns of ancient Rome. Back in Washington, Polk followed every step of the war with obsessive focus. He read field reports late into the night, often by candlelight, scribbling notes in the margins. He wanted limited war, swift war, purposeful war, not a drawn-out conquest. That restraint, though real, didn't stop his political enemies from accusing him of imperial ambition. The strange thing is that the American public didn't hate it. This was the age of manifest destiny, the grand, self-confident belief that the nation was meant to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific, as inevitable as sunrise. As the war escalated, Polk felt the weight of every decision. Mothers' letters pleaded for their son's safety. Editors challenged his morality. Senators called him reckless, brilliant, dangerous, visionary, often on the same day. Yet he pressed on. In quiet moments, Polk admitted privately that he didn't enjoy war, not even victory, but he believed in results. He believed in finishing the map. He believed history rarely rewarded hesitation. And in 1847, history was about to accelerate.
Chapter 8: Hulls of the Montezumas. By the spring of 1847, the war had grown larger than any prediction, slipping out of Polk's grip like a kite in strong wind. Victories had come, yes, but so had political storms, moral debates, and unexpected heroes who suddenly overshadowed the president himself. That was the predictable irony of war. The man in the White House planned it, but the men on the battlefield stole the story. General Zachary Taylor, with his sleepy eyes and mud-caked boots, had become a national icon after the Battle of Buena Vista. Newspapers crowned him a warrior farmer, a new American Cincinnatus. Polk, recognizing a rising political rival, quietly shifted attention toward another general, one more polished, more controllable, or so Polk hoped: Winfield Scott. Scott was everything Taylor wasn't: imposing, disciplined, a meticulous planner who loved rules the way other men loved whiskey. His soldiers called him Old Fuss and Feathers, half mockery, half admiration. Polk handed Scott a monumental task: invade central Mexico and strike at its heart. The campaign began with something audacious: an amphibious landing at Veracruz, the largest such operation in American history up to that point. Scott orchestrated it with precision that would have impressed a Prussian general. Over 10,000 troops landed under the shadow of ancient Spanish fortifications. No blunders, no chaos, just a slow, steady tightening of the noose around the city. Veracruz surrendered after a brutal bombardment. Scott didn't celebrate. He studied maps, issued orders, and marched west toward Mexico City, the legendary Halls of the Montezumas, as American soldiers proudly sang. The road from Veracruz to the capital was a ribbon of mountains, ravines, and fortresses older than the United States itself. Mexican General Santa Anna, ambitious, unpredictable, nearly mythical, mounted resistance at every turn. Cerro Gordo, Contreras, Churubusco. Each battle felt like a stone dropping into the river of history, sending ripples all the way back to Washington. Polk read each report with tightening jaw muscles. He admired Scott's success, but he dreaded what came with it: political glory. A winning general was a dangerous thing in a republic. The last one, George Washington, became president. Andrew Jackson did too. Now the nation had two new potential giants, Taylor and Scott. But the war machine kept moving. By September 1847, Scott's troops stood before Chapultepec Castle, perched on a rocky hill guarding the western entrance to Mexico City. The fortress looked like something conjured from a medieval tale: tall walls, cannons peeking from stone embrasures, flags whipping in the highland wind. The assault was fierce. Young cadets, los niños héroes, fought to the last breath, some choosing to leap from the walls wrapped in the Mexican flag rather than surrender. It became one of the most emotional and symbolic moments in Mexican national memory. On the American side, future giants of the Civil War fought shoulder to shoulder. Ulysses S. Grant, scaling walls with daring recklessness. Robert E. Lee, scouting paths through enemy defenses. History, in its strange habit, was planting seeds for a future tragedy even as another war raged. When Chapultepec fell, Mexico City lay open. Scott answered the capital with restrained dignity. No triumphant parades, no shouting, just the quiet knowledge that the war's final chapter had begun. Back in Washington, Polk felt a measure of vindication. The nation had pushed its boundaries to the Pacific. California was within reach. New Mexico was effectively taken.
The Rio Grande was secure. Polk had achieved more territorial expansion in 4 years than any president before or since. But victory felt complicated. Critics accused him of provoking the war. Moral opponents condemned it as an act of aggression. And across the country, new states, and the question of whether they'd be slave or free, loomed like storm clouds. For now, though, the guns fell silent. Negotiations began. And Polk, exhausted but resolute, prepared to redraw the map of North America. War was ending. History, impatient creature that it is, was already turning the page. Chapter 9. The Treaty That Redrew a Continent. The winter of 1848 came with a strange stillness, as if both nations, Mexico and the United States, were catching their breath after 2 years of grinding war. Snow fell quietly over Washington City, softening even the sharp edges of politics. And yet, inside the White House, President James Polk felt anything but calm. On February 2, in a quiet town outside Mexico City called Guadalupe Hidalgo, American diplomat Nicholas Tris signed a treaty that would reshape the map of North America. Trist was not supposed to be there. Polk had recalled him months earlier, frustrated by delays and suspicious of Trist's independence. Tris disobeyed. He stayed. He negotiated. And now he had delivered the biggest land transfer since Napoleon sold Louisiana. Polk's reaction was a tangle of relief and irritation. The treaty achieved nearly everything he wanted. Mexico recognized the Rio Grande as the Texas border, ceded California and New Mexico, and accepted a payment of $15 million. The United States gained a stretch of land so vast it seemed to swallow the horizon. Future states like California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and parts of Colorado and New Mexico. It was the kind of geopolitical victory presidents were supposed to celebrate. But Polk hated insubordination. Trist's refusal to obey orders gnawed at him. The president spent nights pacing the halls of the White House, weighing pride against practicality. Polk, a man who had built his entire career on discipline and determination, now relied on a treaty forged by a diplomat who ignored him. In the end, Polk accepted the treaty, recommending it to the Senate with a sigh that never made the history books. America celebrated. Fireworks burst over big cities. Newspapers proclaimed the arrival of a continental republic stretching from sea to shining sea. Young men dreamed of California's gold-speckled rivers, though actual gold fever was still months away. Merchants predicted new trade routes, and farmers imagined endless fields under western skies. But not everyone cheered. The anti-slavery movement condemned the war as a land grab orchestrated to expand the slave-holding South. Free soilers demanded that the new territories remain free. Southern leaders insisted the new land must allow slavery. Every new mile of land became a new argument, a new trench in the growing sectional divide. Polk had expanded the country, yes, but he had also expanded the battlefield for a future conflict no treaty could prevent. In cabinet meetings, Polk tried to focus on bookkeeping, costs, logistics, troop withdrawals, but the mood was unsteady. His health was fading. The long hours, constant pressure, and the public's endless demands carved lines into his face. The once energetic expansionist now felt older than his years. Still, there were moments of triumph. He looked at the new map spread across his desk, a continent skeleton redrawn with fresh ink. He saw the Pacific coast now unquestionably American. He saw ports that would one day welcome ships from Asia. He saw deserts and mountains that later generations would tame. Polk believed firmly, almost stubbornly, that he had completed the mission he promised the people. Few presidents, he wrote in his diary, have accomplished in 4 years what we have accomplished. Yet, beneath that confidence was something quieter. Regret? Fatigue? Perhaps the creeping realization that power has a price, one he was paying with pieces of himself he could never reclaim. As Congress debated the treaty, Polk sat in his office, listening to the muffled echo of horse hooves on Pennsylvania Avenue. Washington was growing, buzzing, modernizing, but the young republic still felt fragile, as though the ink of its identity had not yet dried. On March 10, 1848, the Senate ratified the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The war was officially over. The country exhaled. The president closed his diary for the night. The map was complete. But the fault lines beneath the surface were widening.
Chapter 10: The Sunset of a President. James K. Polk left the White House in March 1849 under a gray sky that looked like it had forgotten how to shine. The inauguration of his successor, Zachary Taylor, his own war hero, his own unintended creation, played out before him. Crowds cheered, bands blared patriotic marches, and Polk stood quietly, watching the nation he had reshaped celebrate a man who had risen partly at his expense. His 4 years had felt like 10. Expansion, war, political combat, endless nights of paperwork and planning. He had poured every ounce of himself into the presidency, and now he was leaving it all behind. He and Sarah, his steadfast partner, began the journey home to Tennessee. At each stop, crowds gathered. Some thanked him for expanding America from ocean to ocean. Some merely stared, unsure how to greet a man who had altered the map of their world. Polk appreciated the praise, tolerated the indifference, and ignored the whispers that followed him like fading echoes. He looked older. Washington had taken its toll. His once sharp gaze softened. His voice grew quieter. For the first time in decades, he had no more battles to fight. But the country he left behind was buzzing with energy. Just weeks after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, a carpenter named James Marshall had discovered gold at Sutter's Mill in California. The news trickled eastward, then rushed, then exploded. By 1849, tens of thousands of men poured west, chasing glittering fantasies in cold rivers and steep ravines. California, still raw, wild, and barely organized, was becoming the new beating heart of America's ambition. Polk had predicted California's value, but even he hadn't foreseen this avalanche of humanity. Gold fever rewrote the American dream. It sparked commerce, migration, and myth. Almost overnight, the Pacific coast became not the end of the world, but the beginning of a new one. Yet beneath this golden promise, darker shadows stretched. Every new territory demanded an answer to the question Polk never resolved. Would slavery follow the flag? Politicians shouted, newspapers raged, the North and South circled each other like storm clouds, readying for a future downpour. Polk had expanded the nation's borders, but he had also expanded its tensions. Some praised him as a visionary, Others accused him of lighting a fuse he didn't live to see explode. History, ever complicated, refused to choose between the versions. When Polk finally returned to Nashville, he was determined to enjoy the quiet life he had postponed for 30 years. He purchased a grand home, polished floors gleaming under the Tennessee sun. He spoke of reading books, tending gardens, writing memoirs, and savoring the peace he had never known in public office. But fate had other plans. Just 3 months after leaving the presidency, he fell ill, likely cholera, the relentless disease that stalked travelers of the era. His strength faded rapidly. Sarah remained by his side, holding his hand, reading him letters from friends and statesmen who praised his service. On June 15, 1849, James K. Polk died at the age of 53. He was the youngest former president to pass away and one of the most exhausted. The nation barely had time to react. The gold rush drowned out most other headlines, and Polk slipped quietly into history. For years, Americans debated him. Was he a master of purposeful expansion, completing the vision of a coast-to-coast republic? Or was he the architect of a conflict that pushed the country closer to civil war? Was he brilliant or reckless, disciplined or rigid, essential or dangerous? The truth, as always, was more tangled. Polk was a man of fierce purpose, the kind who burns bright and disappears early. He promised to serve only 4 years, achieve 4 goals, and then step aside. He kept that promise with stubborn exactness. The United States he left behind was bigger, richer, more confident, and more divided. His legacy was a continent. His shadow was a warning. And somewhere in the tumult of the 19th century, America continued forward, carrying both the promise and the burden of the map he left behind. James K. Polk entered the White House with a strict promise and an iron will. 4 years, 4 goals, and no second term. When he walked out exhausted and diminished, he had kept every vow, and in doing so, reshaped a continent. The boundaries of the United States had expanded to the Pacific. California was on the brink of a gold-fueled transformation, and the nation stepped into the global spotlight as a rising power. Yet Polk's legacy was never simple. The land he gained ignited political fires he could not extinguish, widening the divisions between North and South and accelerating the march toward civil war. History rarely hands out neat judgments. Polk remains both a visionary and a warning, proof that ambition can build empires and that every victory carries its own shadows. His presidency was brief but seismic, a reminder that the people who change the world are not always the ones celebrated with monuments or holidays. As the dust of the 1840s settles and we look back across the arc of American history, Polk's story stands as a lesson in power, consequences, and the restless spirit of a nation determined to define its destiny. The map bears his imprint. The future bore his impact.
If you liked this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so we can keep bringing you more great stories.